Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Deuteronomy. Today we begin looking at chapter 2. Now we saw in chapter 1 that Moses gave the Israelites the reason they had had to spend all those years in the wilderness. It was because of rebellion. They had refused to believe that God would give them possession of the promised land. In their fear, they fell into disbelief. As a result, God said, "This generation will pass away in the wilderness. Your children will possess the promised land." And now in chapter 2, Moses continues that theme by giving them sort of a brief history of the years they spent in the wilderness. Now it begins in verse 1, which is one of the saddest words in the book of Deuteronomy. Listen to verse 1. "So we turned back and we set out toward the wilderness along the route to the Red Sea." Notice those words, we turned back and we set out toward the wilderness. In other words, the Israelites had to turn back from the promised land and turn to the wilderness because they had refused to believe. That would result in 40 years of wilderness wandering. You know, it's always that way. When we fall into disbelief, when we don't believe God, when we're not sure He can fulfill His promises, as the Israelites were not sure He could give them the promised land, that leads to wilderness journeys. They had to spend 40 years in the wilderness because they turned back from the promise of God. They turned back from the promised land and had to spend those years of wilderness wanderings. Let's take these words as a warning to us to always believe God, to not look at the difficulty that lies before us, the difficulty of taking the promised land, to not look at the hardships, the giants in the land, but rather let's look at the promises of God. You know, when we look at the difficulties, when we look at the hardships, we tend to get afraid and fall into disbelief. But when we focus on the promises of God, our faith will grow. We'll know that He can and will do what He has promised to do. Keep your focus, keep your gaze on God's promise. That will increase your faith. Well, the original Israelites did not, and so they had to turn back and wandered in the wilderness. But even in the wilderness journeyings, God took care of them. Now, the first 23 verses or so of chapter 2 sort of describe the wanderings in the wilderness, kind of gives the geography of it. But notice in the midst of that, God reminds them that He took care of them even when they wandered in the wilderness. Notice it says in verse 7, "The Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He has watched over your journeys through this vast wilderness. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you. You have not lacked anything." For 40 years, the children of Israel had wandered in the wilderness, but God always took care of them. Even though it was their own failure to believe that resulted in the wilderness journeys, yet God was faithful to His care of them. He watched over them. He provided for them. They lacked nothing. Every day they received the manna. Every day they received the bread. Every day the providential grace of God took care of them. God cared for them, even in the wilderness. You know, sometimes when we're wandering in the wilderness, we wonder, is God going to still care for us? He does. God is always faithful. He's always faithful. He takes care of His people. Moses is reminding the children of Israel, for these last 40 years, while you're in the wilderness, God has cared for you. And now the time has come for you to go in to possess the land. Now, if you read carefully through this geography of how they traveled, we'll notice they had gone up on the east side of the Jordan River. And that was different from the original plan. Way back 40 years ago when they left Mount Sinai, they were supposed to invade the promised land from the south. On the west side of the Dead Sea, the west side of the Jordan River, they were to come up to what would eventually be the tribe of Judah and possess the land. They refused. But now as they approach it 40 years later, now they're coming up the east side of the Jordan River. Then what is today the country of Jordan. So they're on the east side of the Jordan River. They're going to come into the promised land across the Jordan River this time. But now they've traveled up through along the east side of the Dead Sea, and now they're camped out on the east side of the Jordan River, and they're ready to cross over the river, into the promised land. And so Moses reminds them, for 40 years God has protected you. Now the time has come. Ready your hearts. We're going to cross the Jordan and take possession of the promised land. Hope you join us tomorrow. We continue looking at chapter 2 in our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Deuteronomy.